this very thing occurred after an enormous increase in the risk that was offered by the central bank in the United States. In 1980, the Monetary Control Act was passed to increase by 10 times the guarantees for deposits in banks. And many institutions shifted the money from sound investment into risky investments. So this chart shows the list of, or the number of bank failures that occurred in the late 1980s as a result of this moral hazard. This is hundreds of banks that failed as a result of the new moral hazard. Did the central banks, did the government learn from this mistake? No. They did more of it in a bigger way, even in other countries. The Monetary Control Act authorized the Federal Reserve Board to guarantee money internationally. This chart shows that the same application of guarantees from government institutions like the IMF, the G20, and the Federal Reserve Board also encourage money to go from secure countries to risky countries. So we had bailouts in Mexico, Russia, Brazil, Asia. Okay, next one. And now we have our current bailout. Everybody is clamoring for the government to do something. For doctors, the advice is first, do no harm. For Keynesian economists is first, do more harm. The idea is we have created this problem with too much bad debt, so we will solve this problem with much, much more debt. It is like saying to a patient, you are very obese and you have heart trouble. We will cure this with a whole bucket full of fat. My friend Robert Poole says it is like treating a patient who needs a blood transfusion by taking blood out of the right arm and putting it into the left arm and spilling half of the blood on the ground. Now, what motivates these politicians to do this? Next. It is not a small amount of money, it is an enormous amount of money. Last November, they estimated the cost would be over $8 trillion. So this is now compared to the cost of many other programs that the government has had. NASA, the space program, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, and all of these other crises don't even amount to half of the expected bailout. And this was last November. Since then, it has grown much greater. To put it in another way, in inflation-adjusted dollars, it is twice as much as the entire cost of World War II. Now, as in every war, the government grows, and the power of politicians grows right along with it. In order to get public approval of such a massive expenditure, they have to be driven to the sense of panic and fear, as if this was a war.
Yes.
Oh. Ah, good. Okay. I forgot to introduce my daughter. She really should be giving this talk. She knows it better than I do. She is studying economics at the University of Buckingham in England. And what other daughter would spend her spring break with her father giving economics lectures? And this is my brother from Vilnius, Virgis Daukas, who came. He is really quite a hero in Lithuania. He founded the Lithuanian Free Market Institute and a liberal party. And he's had television shows. He's a great champion of liberty in Lithuania. Now let me ask a question. I just want to stir the blood and get you to participate in a question. The question is this. Do you trust the campaign promises of politicians? Okay, first let me ask those who say, now this is generally speaking, not some one person, but generally speaking, how many people say, yes, I do trust the campaign promises of politicians? How many say, no, I do not trust the campaign promises of politicians? Now, sure, there are some who feel agreeable, but most generally do not. And let me ask this. Do politicians, generally speaking, have higher moral standards than your own or lower moral standards than your own? How many people say politicians generally have higher moral standards than my own? How many people say politicians generally have lower moral standards than my own? Well, this skepticism is often shared by Americans as well. This survey of the honesty and ethical standards of people in different professions shows that the politicians rank, well, rather low, just slightly above prostitutes and car salesmen. If this is true, that there isn't a good basis or there's a good reason to be skeptical of the ethical standards of politicians, why do we trust them with so much money? It's so often during the fear of a war that people turn over great power to someone who says they have the solution. Now let's see, how are these industries in the United States influencing the decision makers? This is the 2008 campaign contributions by industry, and the #1 industry is finance, insurance, and real estate. They have contributed, just last year, almost $500 million to the political campaigns, equally to Democrats and Republicans. Not to all candidates, but to candidates they can be assured will give them all the money they need. Most people don't know, even in America, most people don't know that there were many people running for president, because the only two they heard from were the two that had the money to tell them that the bailout was necessary. None of the others would have supported this current bailout. Now let's take a look at the contributions by company. For one example, let's take Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs, the chairman of the CEO of Goldman Sachs was Robert Rubin, the U.S. Secretary of Treasury under Clinton. He was the CEO of Goldman Sachs was the Secretary of the Treasury under Clinton. Henry Paulson, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, became the Secretary of Treasury under George Bush. When Alan Greenspan retired as the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Central Bank, when he retired as chairman of the Central Bank, the next week he made a conference call for 20 minutes with Goldman Sachs, and for 20 minutes of advice he was paid $120,000. I consider these deferred bribes. Okay, here we have the amount of money that they made in contributions, and here is the amount of money they received in the bailout. We have in America what's called the Iron Triangle, where financial institutions contribute to politicians. Politicians set up government agencies to give bailouts. This money comes from the pockets of taxpayers. Now, investors know a good investment when they see it. Investment companies know how to see a good investment. For every dollar of campaign contributions, they received $2,600 in bailout money. There is no better investment in the world than a well-placed politician. And if you're worried about supporting the wrong candidate, well, support both of them. How could you lose? There is no better investment in the world than a well-placed politician. And if you're worried about supporting the wrong candidate, well, support both of them. How could you lose? This bailout is coming from a multitude of government agencies. This bailout money is being pledged by a multitude or many government agencies. They say there was a lack of regulation. Well, it wasn't for a lack of regulating agencies. All of these agencies that were entrusted to do regulation only gave the illusion that they were doing so. An example of this was the Securities and Exchange Commission. 8 years ago, they were warned 5 times about a fraudulent scheme by Bernie Madoff. He is now charged and convicted of a $60 billion fraud, but the people who should be going to jail with him are the regulators who turned the other way when they were warned of this fraud 8 years ago. And by ignoring the fraud, many hundreds of people were lured or drawn into this investment, assuming that they were being regulated. It is the concept of moral hazard at its greatest. The largest amount of the subsidy, of the bailout, will come from the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Treasury Department. The Federal Reserve Board was created in 1913 to prevent crises. But Austrian economists like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and Murray Rothbard demonstrated that they were not the solution, but the cause of these crises. The Great Depression occurred afterwards because of the actions of the Federal Reserve Board. This chart shows in gray the recessions over the last 50 years, 60 years. And the blue line shows the interest rates set by the Federal Reserve banking system. Each recession was preceded by the raising of interest rates. The bubble was created by a lowering of the interest rates.
A bańka była tworzona przez obniżanie stóp procentowych.
The most dramatic case is the current one. The big bubble that we experienced in the last several years, was caused by very low interest rates for a very long time, which encouraged a lot of lending. Government guarantees ensured that it would be unwise lending. Then changing the interest rate brought on popping the bubble. The Federal Reserve Board prints money. And this chart shows the value, the purchasing power of the dollar for 200 years. From 1800 to the present. For the time that it was on a gold standard, the purchasing power of a dollar was very stable, except during wartime. During wars, governments always print money because it is an easy way to pay for something and then to tax the people after the war. The Federal Reserve Board was created in 1913 in order to print the money to fight World War I. And then in 1933, they abandoned the gold standard and started to print up endless amounts of money. And the value of the dollar has plummeted. It's only 2% now of what it was just 70 years ago. As you know, when people print up a lot of money, it causes inflation. Here's this 10 billion dinar note from Serbia. With it, you could buy an egg. But you had to spend it quickly, because by the end of the week, you needed 50 billion dinars to buy the same egg. But then you had to spend that one, because by the end of the next week, you needed 500 billion dinars. If you print money, you'll go to jail, because you're robbing society of products and making everyone's money worthless. When the government does it in a very big way, it is called monetary policy. But the effect is the same. This chart shows the monetary base of the United States economy, the high-powered money. From 1960, we had this much cash and bank reserves. the monetary base has increased over the decades, and then in the last 6 months, it's been almost doubled. That really scares me, because if they knew what they were doing, we wouldn't have this crisis. But my brother says they do know what they're doing. That's really scary. Because if they know what they're doing, it's really dangerous for all of us who expect that they're keeping the public trust. Inflation always has winners and losers. It doesn't affect everybody the same. People on fixed incomes, savers, pensioners, renters, they're expecting their money to be a store of value. But when the government ruins that store of value, everybody tries to trade this away for something that's going to hold its value. Debtors like inflation because they pay back in cheaper money. People with real estate and gold find that everybody wants it, so the value goes up. In Serbia, anyone who was holding Deutschmarks or dollars had something more valuable than dinars. Anyone with museum collectibles had something that was increasing in value. Now, who owns the most in every category? The government owns the most debt in every country of the world. The government owns the most real estate in every country of the world. The government owns the most gold, the most foreign currencies, the most museum collectibles. And the government gets to print the money and spend it first before the prices go up. And if people have to earn more money to keep up with higher prices, they get to collect more taxes. This is what the median house price is in Hawaii. The median price of a house doubled in just a few years in Hawaii. My house increased in value in 3 years by more than what I earned as a professor in 5 years. Well, good for me, but there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Where did that value come from? It came out of the pockets of everyone with a fixed wage, savings, or pension who's holding the paper instead of a house. Let me talk about solutions now. I assert the best policy is one of personal responsibility, and that means bankruptcy instead of bailouts. Bailout keeps the same managers, owners in place who made bad decisions at the expense of stealing from innocent taxpayers. Bankruptcy is much better because it transfers assets from bad owners and managers to better owners and managers.
Lepsza jest upadłość ze względu na to, że
from bad owners and managers to good owners. Bankruptcy can take a little bit of time, but it's necessary as an adjustment in economy. The assets are still there and will still function if they are valuable. And bailouts will only make it deeper and longer by keeping assets in the wrong hands. Bailout keeps the same managers, owners in place who made bad decisions at the expense of stealing from innocent taxpayers. Bankruptcy is much better because it transfers assets from bad owners and managers to better owners and managers.
Lepsza jest upadłość ze względu na to, że
from bad owners and managers to good owners.
Że
bankruptcy can take a little bit of time, but it's necessary as an adjustment in economy. The assets are still there and will still function if they are valuable. And bailouts will only make it deeper and longer by keeping assets in the wrong hands. I also call for personal responsibility for politicians and government officials, with vigorous prosecution of corruption, bribery, and fraud. With vigorous prosecution of corruption in the form of bribery, fraud, and malfeasance.
Politycy powinni ponosić kary za korupcję, za łapówki, oszustwa i malwersacje.
And I think it's necessary to re-examine the idea of corporate limited liability. 200 years ago, Scottish banks were some of the most secure in the world. The owners of those banks had to pay their depositors even if it came from their entirely from their own pockets, which caused them to be very much more careful in what they did with the depositors' money. In the long run, I think we need a devolution of power. And for this, I think there is no better example than the New Zealand model for wiping out debt by free market reforms. I will assert that every government of the world could get rid of its debt by selling assets. Also, there should be an end of the monopoly of power over finance. I think people should be given a choice in currency. Americans had a choice in currency briefly. These are the Liberty Dollar. They are warehouse receipts for gold and silver. People should be allowed to choose to make contracts and to earn money and pay off debts in solid money if they want. But last year, at this time, the US government said this was too much of a threat to the US dollar. The government confiscated $20 million in their vaults and put them out of business. Then I would also not only end legal tender laws, but also the central bank itself and its control over interest rates and manipulation of markets. Now, I think I'm concluded, and I would wish to open up to any thoughts or questions.
Mam pytanie do pana profesora. W jakim stopniu pan uważa tezę tę za prawdziwą, że obecny kryzys został wywołany brakiem ryzyka?
I think that the crisis is due entirely to this removal of risk. Well, not entirely. There are multiple things. It's a very, very big player in this issue. The business cycles are accentuated by the government's interventions, by creation of money, and the creation of money is largely to fund these bubbles. They get risky malinvestment, it gets into trouble, they expand the money supply to try and prevent the collapse of those things. So it's part of it. The bad risk is going to cause a collapse, but they try to prevent that risk from happening by pumping up the money supply to try to hide the risky investments that have been made. And I think it just makes it longer and worse. Let me just add one more thing. The Austrian school of thought says that there may always be malinvestment, but readjustment is inevitable as a way to find out what consumers really value. The government tries to prevent that readjustment by pumping up an inflated economy, but that just makes it worse. Yes?
I'm not an economist, so maybe my question will be very simple, but how do we know that getting rid of central banks would be really better for the economy, since the since the central banks are part of the economy for the nearly last of the century, how do we know that this process will be actually better than it is now?
Good point. There's an interesting study done by George Selgin. Okay. Good. And, no. Yeah, no. Okay, well, I'll tell you about it. Where there is more governmental intervention, George Selgin says there is much more likelihood of crisis. Where people are free in the market to take risk and assume responsibility, they are much more quick to respond to changes in consumer values and in good and bad investments. George Selgin did an extensive bit of research about the high degrees of regulation in these countries prior to 1933 and the low degrees of regulation in these countries prior to 1933. His conclusion was that for every 100 years of banking experience, that these countries with a high degree of governmental intervention in banking had an average of 8 times as many banking crises as the banks with minimal or no banking regulation. I know it seems counterintuitive because we like to believe that regulators are serving us. But it turns out that regulators are always serving special interests at the expense of us. So the interests of the politicians and the regulators are their own interests rather than of the general public.
Co pan profesor sądzi o poglądzie, że bankructwo banków spowoduje run na banki? Run.
Good question. Why do people fear that their money isn't in the bank? Because we have banks practice a deceit. It's called fractional reserve banking for demand deposits. 100% reserve banking says if you deposit money into a bank, it's there for you. But fractional reserve banking authorizes banks to tell you that your money is there, when in fact only a small percentage is there. So people are kind of tricked into thinking that their money should be there, when in fact it isn't. So for demand deposits, I call this a deceit against the depositor. If you really want to be sure your money is there and never worry about it, banks should be obliged to have it there.
Ponownie ukłon w stronę firmy pana Kubania, Quality Software Business, za to, że tak znamienity gość w czasach kryzysu, w czasach, kiedy tyle się mówi o tym, że przedsiębiorcy są w kryzysie, nie chcą, zaciskają pasa, tutaj taki piękny gest, dzięki któremu będzie można...
Ja może się wytłumaczę. Ja uwielbiam kryzys. Jestem człowiekiem urodzonym w kryzysie. Wspaniale się pracuje, bo wtedy ludziom się chce pracować po prostu. Także jesteśmy w ciągłym kryzysie.
Także jeszcze raz bardzo dziękuję w imieniu organizatorów i samego profesora. Kilka słów na temat profesora Schoollanda. Profesor Schoolland przez kilka lat pracował w Waszyngtonie, w sercu biurokracji amerykańskiej. W różnych departamentach był też członkiem jednej z komisji zajmującej się taryfami handlowymi w Departamencie Handlu No i może to doświadczenie spowodowało, że tak znienawidził biurokrację, podatki, państwo, że od tamtej pory nie chce mieć z tym państwem nic wspólnego. Dąży do ograniczania biurokracji. W swoich wykładach prezentuje iście libertariańskie podejście do społeczeństwa, do ekonomii. Takim najlepszym dowodem na idee, jakie wierzy profesor Schoolland, jest ta książka Przygoda Jonathana, przetłumaczona na ponad 40 języków. W przyszłym miesiącu się ukaże wersja arabska tej książki w Jordanii. To są w formie bajkowej opowieść o Jonathanie, który przypływa na wyspę i coś go tam zastaje, jakaś rzeczywistość i on się zmierza z tą rzeczywistością. I mimo, że jest to bajka, myślę, że wnioski, jakie płyną z tejże bajki, są nie tylko dla dzieci i młodzieży, ale myślę, że nie jeden dorosły człowiek może dużo się z tego dowiedzieć, dużo poznać i zrozumieć podstawy gospodarki wolnorynkowej. Jeszcze dodam, że profesor na kilku uniwersytetach amerykańskich wykładał, ale oprócz tego jest zagorzałym zwolennikiem idei libertariańskich, brał udział w kilkunastu konferencjach organizowanych przez ISIL, International Society for Individual Liberty, którego stowarzyszenia jest w ogóle członkiem zarządu. Ponadto w grudniu ubiegłego roku został zaproszony do członkostwa w bardzo elitarnym gronie Montpelleron Society, założonym po II wojnie światowej przez takich myślicieli jak Karl Popper, Friedrich August von Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, Milton Friedman. No jest to z całą pewnością wielkie wyróżnienie. I przed Państwem profesor Ken Schoolland z wykładem na temat rzeczywistych, prawdziwych przyczyn obecnego kryzysu finansowego i jakie mogą być próby rozwiązania tego kryzysu z perspektywy i w opinii pana profesora. Oddaję głos. Dziękuję.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. Aloha. I'm very grateful to PAFERE, the Polish-American Foundation for Economic Research and Education. But of course that is people such as Pavel, Jan Malik, Mr. Kuban, and so many of the supporters. And I'm very grateful to my translator, Karen. She warned me I'm allowed no more than 3 sentences at a time. If I go beyond that, I have to learn Polish. So, please understand that throughout my talk today, I will use no periods, only commas. My entire talk today is one long sentence. Okay, the issue of the day, and by the way, this group looks so good, and you have such intelligent questions and ideas. I would like to replace the entire U.S. Congress with this group. That would elevate the IQ by 50 points. Today I'm going to talk about the monetary crisis, and I wish to start off with a question to you. Suppose that you have $10,000 to invest. You will take both the gain or the loss, and you have these 2 choices. You can put your money bank secure or to bank risk. Bank secure lends their money to people with good credit history, good collateral, and good income. These are long-established businesses and homes. And the other option is to bank risk. They offer their money to people who borrow for, well, more risky ventures. Maybe a new resort at the beach, a brand new office building, maybe an internet concept on the internet. And because these are new, untried, they don't have a good credit history. They don't have good collateral, and they don't have yet any income. Now, there are customers in this category who will use resorts and office buildings, and there are customers in this category. But each person has a different attitude towards risk. Some people are more cautious than others. So please, let me ask you now to raise your hand for those who would put your money into bank secure, so I can count, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Okay, thank you. Now, please raise your hand if you would be voting to put your money into bank risk. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay, so keep track of the numbers. I think I counted 19 and 15. Okay, now we're going to just change the situation just a little bit. The government is going to offer a no-risk guarantee. You may take the gain, but you don't have to worry about the loss. If you deposit your money into a financial institution that goes bankrupt, you will not take the loss. So let me just ask you to take that decision again about your investment. Okay, now please raise your hand if you would put your money into Bank Secure. I see 1, 2, 3. Now, please raise your hand if you would be putting your money into Bank Risk. Raise your hand. Okay, I'll save my effort on the counting. You get my point that when, yes, it's almost everybody here that raised their hand. It's probably, and it's a natural thing because, well, you see that there's only gain and no loss. So the gain is twice as good here. You have 10% interest here and only 5% interest there. So, well, the problem with this is that we have taken money out of secure investments and placed it into risky investments. And this leads to what the Austrian School of Economics calls a malinvestment bubble. There is insufficient amount of money for such customers as would like to borrow for secure investments, and there's an abundance of money available for these investments that are very risky. But that means that there are too many businesses over here for the number of customers. And overbuilding of offices means the offices stay empty, no renters. In these resorts, they're beautiful, but they have no customers. They may have had enough customers for a small number of investors, but not for all of the investors that have been encouraged in that kind of business. This is, in economics, referred to as the problem of moral hazard, where the government's effort to remove risk encourages reckless behavior. The problem is that now we have an unstable bubble of inflation. These businesses on this risky side are now very vulnerable and fragile. As they start to fail, they seek assistance from the government, which comes from the taxpayers. I hardly accept the principle of PAFERE that this is a problem of a violation of the 7th commandment. It is taking money from taxpayers essentially to bail out a large number of failing businesses that have made unwise decisions. To guarantee that these government institutions do not close them down, there are enormous payoffs from these institutions into politicians and agencies to keep them going with more bailout.